My name's Emma Cramp. I'm one of the AMR project leads working with NHS Improvement, and also my normal day job is an antimicrobial pharmacist at Leicester. So I'm going to briefly talk about the new CQUIN, in particular the AMR parts of the CQUIN, so that's 2C and 2D. Now these are provisional changes. We haven't yet heard from NHS England who haven't signed them off finally yet. So these are provisional changes I will discuss. And this is the CQUIN that will run from April 2018 to March 2019. So I'll discuss what the purpose of the CQUIN is, although Celia's given a really good background. I'll discuss the changes to the antibiotic review part of the CQUIN, so that's 2C. I'll talk about the antibiotic consumption section and the changes there to part 2D. And then I'll highlight where to find information for the new CQUIN, run through what good looks like in terms of CQUIN performance, and then highlight key areas to focus on so that you can help achieve those CQUIN targets. I'll then finally talk about the joint webinar that's happening tomorrow with Public Health England and NHS Improvement, where we'll go through the finer detail of the CQUIN. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll run through the basic changes that are happening, and tomorrow during the webinar we'll go in depth into how you collect the data, where you find the data collection tools, etc. So the purpose of the AMR parts of the CQUIN, so 2C and 2D, well, really there's a clear focus on improving stewardship, and this involves driving thorough antibiotic reviews where there's a clear documented evidence in the medical notes for the wider clinical team to view. This will also help direct clinicians to review empirical treatment, review test results, and then reevaluate treatment. And therefore, it will help guide IV to oral switch and also de-escalation of antibiotic treatment. So the AMR part of the CQUIN, as Celia's already mentioned, works in conjunction with the sepsis sections of the CQUIN, so 2A and 2B. But also we've been linking in with the work that Public Health England, NHS England and RHI have been working on, which is reducing inappropriate prescribing by 50% by 2021. So the CQUIN will help ensure that these 24 to 72-hour reviews for each antibiotic will help reduce inappropriate prescribing. We should also be thinking about altering the proportion of antibiotics that we're currently using. So, for example, reducing broad-spectrum antibiotics and increasing narrow-spectrum antibiotic treatment. So, to start off with, I'll talk about the antibiotic review section. So this is part 2C. So, as you can see here, I've highlighted in red any changes to the new CQUIN, so it's clear for everyone. So there's 3 criteria that the antibiotic review needs to meet. Now, having said that, none of these criteria are essentially new. They've just been reworded or tweaked to make them a lot clearer. So each antibiotic that's reviewed for the treatment of sepsis will be included in the CQUIN will need to be reviewed following the 3 criteria as follows. So criterion 1 hasn't changed. The clinical review must take place by an appropriate clinician, so an infection senior doctor, and by that we mean ST3 and above, an infection pharmacist, or a member of the senior clinical team looking after the patient on the ward, and again that's ST3 or above. So criterion 2 should look familiar to most of you. And again, this hasn't really changed that much. So it's the documented review that should consist of one of the 7 prescribing decisions, sort of following a start, smart, then focus approach. So those 7 options are stop, IV to oral switch with a documented review date or duration of the oral antibiotic, refer the patient to OPAT, continue the same antibiotic but have a new review date or duration, change the antibiotic, so escalate to a broad-spectrum antibiotic with a new review date or duration, change and de-escalate to a narrow-spectrum agent, and again, have a new review date or duration, and change based on blood culture results with a new duration and review date. So hopefully those sections in red highlight the need for every antibiotic prescription that's reviewed. It must have a duration or review date. And that's essentially the change for the 18-19 CQUIN. So for this CQUIN that's happening at the moment, for 17-18, we have allowed the option where antibiotic prescriptions are reviewed, where you don't necessarily need a review date or duration. And we've really incorporated this just to drive improvements in stewardship. So during this financial year, CQUIN 17-18, during Q2, 99% of hospitals have actually met this target and milestone. So this suggests that it's quite easy to achieve. And I'm sure you're probably already aware, but it's very easy to just document, continue in the medical notes, and not actually think about what we're treating, reviewing micro results, and thinking about the duration as well. So we've incorporated this just to drive improvements in stewardship. So the third criterion details that if the decision for the patient is to remain on an IV antibiotic post the 24 to 72-hour review, there should be a documented rationale in the medical notes as to why that patient needs an IV antibiotic. So these are just examples, but we would expect one of these options to be documented in the medical notes so that it's clear for the clinical team. So perhaps the patient's nil by mouth or not absorbing via the GI tract, or if there's no oral option available, the patient might not be clinically improving, or they might have a deep-seated infection where it's not appropriate to switch from IV to oral, or it might be based on expert advice. So this section has been reworded. It's not necessarily new, because during the 17-18 CQUIN that we're performing now, there's a requirement for you to use IV to oral switch guidelines and incorporate that during your antibiotic reviews anyway. So we've just kind of reworded it and reinforced this section to make it a lot clearer, and these are the expectations. So why have we made these changes? Well, as I mentioned before, the CQUIN results from 17-18 show that 99% of hospitals met the Q1 and Q2 milestones. And the documentation of continue without a review date or stop date was included as an option, and this was primarily being documented as the 24 to 72-hour review, with the majority of decisions being continue. So this sort of suggested that the milestones and indicator were easy to achieve and perhaps not best driving best practice. So this diagram shows what's documented in the Start Smart Then Focus guideline. So the 5 prescribing decisions are linked to having a new review date or stop date, and this is set out in Start Smart Then Focus. So what we try to do is align the CQUIN with the Start Smart Then Focus best practice approach. So moving on to the antibiotic consumption part of the CQUIN, so this is 2D. There's a slight change here. Total antibiotics and the carbapenem indicator is essentially the same. We've left that as it is. However, because of the global shortage of piperacillin tazobactam and the increased focus that we need to have on stewardship, we've removed the piperacillin tazobactam indicator, and that has been replaced with an aware indicator which focuses on the access group of antibiotics. So for those of you who aren't aware of what the aware categories are, Philip Howard is going to discuss this in a lot more detail in the next presentation. But essentially, the WHO aware categories are taken from the antibiotic section of the essential medicines list. The aware categories are made up of access, watch, and reserve. So access is what features in the new CQUIN, and these are narrow-spectrum antibiotics that are primarily used as first-line agents. And then we have the watch and reserve categories, where watch has antibiotics contained within that category, and there is a high risk of resistance there. And reserve is the last line of defence, really. There's a lot more information on the WHO website as well, but as I said, Philip is going to talk more about this later on. So again, why have we made these changes to 2D? Well, there's a heavy reliance on using broad-spectrum antibiotics, where empirical treatment is often started and then continued. And because of the global shortage of piperacillin tazobactam, we've had to remove that from the CQUIN, and there's an increased focus on good antimicrobial stewardship prescribing practices. And also, we should be increasing the variety of antibiotics that we're currently using. So as you can see here, on the left-hand side, we've got a graph showing IV broad-spectrum antibiotic use. This data is pulled from RxInfo defined data. So we've got all the trusts in England on the y-axis, and then we've got DDDs per 1,000 admissions on the x-axis. And you can see there's a huge variation in terms of hospitals using IV broad-spectrum antibiotics, with some hospitals using very little and a lot of hospitals using a lot. And then also on the right-hand side, we also have a graph showing the proportion of antibiotics used within the aware categories. So as you can see, the majority come from access and watch categories. But again, similar to IV broad-spectrum use, there's a lot of variation out there. So where can you find further information about the new CQUIN? Well, as I mentioned, NHS England haven't yet finally signed off this part of the CQUIN. So these are provisional changes, but once NHS England have finally agreed them, they will be uploaded to the NHS England website on that link. And then there'll be further information on the NHS Improvement website, where you can find frequently asked questions, data collection tools, and your baseline data. So this graph, it just shows really the proportion of access antibiotics that are used within England. And as I mentioned before, there's a huge variation, with actually some hospitals doing really well. They're using a lot of narrow-spectrum antibiotics. And where they feature narrow-spectrum antibiotics is normally for a numerous indications, but for example, hospitals that use narrow-spectrum treatment for sepsis are actually already meeting this part of the CQUIN. But then, however, there are other hospitals that have a long way to go. So Public Health England will also host CQUIN performance data on the Fingertips AMR portal. And there's also, for the secondary care pharmacists in the room, there's a new aware categories on the RX Info Define website for you to use. So what does good look like? Well, the majority of hospitals are continuing to reduce their antibiotic consumption during 17-18 for all the three parts of the CQUIN, so piperacillin, tazobactam, carbapenems, and total antibiotics, which is great to see. Despite the difficulties with, winter pressures, increased admissions, reduced staffing levels, they are continuing to meet all three parts of the CQUIN. So just some key areas to focus on to help facilitate your hospital achieve CQUIN. I've just put some bullet points here. So for example, it might be a good idea to review antibiotic guidelines and where possible switch to narrow agents for empirical treatment. And as I said before, those hospitals that are currently using a lot of narrow spectrum agents are probably already meeting this part of the CQUIN. There should be a focus on investigations within guidelines, just to facilitate and help those junior doctors decide on what they should be doing before they start prescribing antibiotics. Education and training is a key essential part of the CQUIN. So really ensuring that all clinical staff are aware of the CQUIN and are aware of what's expected of them on the ground. And that also links in with local education and training at ward level as well. So IV and oral switch reviews could be embedded into clinical practice. So perhaps you could implement a ward round checklist for your clinicians to work through just as a prompt, or stickers could be used in the medical notes to prompt an IV rationale to be documented. Using electronic prescribing systems as well, you could have IV alert systems there, but also regular but varied communication on progress, so feeding back regularly to the clinicians on the ground works well. And something that we have found really effective is having strong and effective multidisciplinary leadership champions at all levels, so not just consultants, but also junior doctors and nurses as well. So for anyone that wants to join into the webinar tomorrow, we'll go into further detail of what the CQUIN consists of. So we'll talk about milestones and targets, how to collect the data, for example. You can register using this website here. Thank you very much.